They say all is fair in love and war, but all is not fair. Why do the good die young? Why does evil prosper? In this series, love and war find their beginning.
You knock these buildings down, we'll hear all of us.
Birds literally dropped from the sky.
But scientists warn the worst is yet to come.
Only by knowing their past do we get clues as to how the story ends.
Every night on the TV news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation.
This is only the beginning.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. How quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
You never really get those sounds out of your mind, especially when you know what they are. Those are the sounds of our ancestors, boys, girls, moms, dads, brothers, sisters, grandparents, friends, people who stood for principle, while men under the influence of the legions carried out the most heinous acts under the agenda of Lucifer, all under the name of the Christian church and the sign of the cross. The prophecies had said Yeshua would rise on the third day. And as was foretold, his followers found his tomb empty on that morning. He'd gone back to the capital of Janah, and everyone was celebrating as he entered. But Yeshua was preoccupied with something. He was focused. And he went straight into the temple, straight to Jah. He wanted to make sure that all had been satisfied, that the covenant was sealed with his blood, and the end of the war was no longer an if, but a when. Once he came out, he shouted a shout of victory that echoed throughout the galaxy. Many religious persons have shared parts of this story I've been sharing with you throughout the world. But most haven't shared the whole story. Many don't like this part of the story. This was a revolutionary moment. The Messiah's teachings taught men to turn the other cheek. Don't cheat others. Treat others like you would want to be treated. Love, don't hate. Forgive, don't hold a grudge. But once Lucifer knew the battle was lost, the battle was on. Nearly 40 years later, the city of peace, Jerusalem, thought to be the eternal city, was burned to the ground. And in just a few decades, all of Yeshua's closest friends, his disciples, had been charged with treason and executed in countries around the world. But one, just one, survived. And finally, they sentenced him to an island prison in the Mediterranean on an island called Patmos. His name was John. They tried to kill him, boil him alive, burn him alive, and other attempts, but they were unsuccessful. So they banished him to this island. He was chosen to write some of the most shocking words in history. 22 pages in the book called the Revelation, which would become more relevant than ever before with each passing century. And the prince came to visit him to reveal to him what would take place in the future. He was shown by one of the guardians the future all the way down to this day and beyond. He was shown that the judgment of Babylon the Great, that global fraudulent system who's done so much damage on the earth, with whom the kings of the earth, it says, committed fornication. John calls her a whore, and he says the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. These aren't my words, that's how John writes it. But in our vernacular, John saw a system, an empire, a global community of selfishness and greed that would become worldwide. A system that puts desire, money, and profits above principle, people, and need. John wrote how the teachings of Yeshua would be hijacked and state-run. He saw the same sequence of empires that the seer Daniel had been shown in vision many years before. The rise and fall of the empires of ancient Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. Well, and then Lucifer changed his methods. St. Peter, as they call him, the very one the universal church was said to be founded upon, made a rather provocative statement in Scripture. He called the eternal city Rome Babylon. And John wrote how this universal Christian church would become the greatest enemy of honest followers of Yeshua. You heard me right. John wrote how the Christian church would become the greatest enemy of the followers of Jesus. Constantine sees this schism that the Christians and pagans had, and he has this epiphany, this vision in battle, and does his best to merge these two diverse belief systems. Just as Daniel had seen nearly 1,000 years before, this persecuting power, under the guise of the Christian church, this hybrid of religion and government, would begin to change laws, calendars, holidays, and holy days. But that was just the beginning. It got much worse. These followers of the carpenter of Nazareth, who wanted to keep the principles that Yeshua had taught, were persecuted and hunted like wild animals. They began to live in the mountains for fear of capture and torture. They wanted freedom of conscience at any cost, and deep down, we all desire the freedom to follow the dictates of our own conscience. The celebration of the weekly holiday of creation on the seventh day was one of their identifying marks. They were called the Waldenses, the Albigenses, the Huguenots, but they could not endure the hatred that existed in the cities of the old world. So they fled to the countryside and remote places in the mountains to try to enjoy life. They wanted to worship the Creator while the pagans enjoyed worshiping the creation. But the falling away from truth and love began the downfall of the old world. History tells us this lasted for over 1,400 years. That's why our history books refer to it as the Dark Ages. Men hated the light and did all they could to shroud everything in mystery and darkness. Under the banner of the cross, this superpower burned, tortured, and imprisoned those who didn't fall in line with the religion of the state. Babylon the Great, that power that John was warned about, ruled the world and built its empire and wealth on the backs of its poor, ignorant citizens. Take St. Peter's Basilica, one of the most beautiful structures on the earth. Do you know how it was funded and built? By salesmen on behalf of the church who would go around into cities and villages and sell certificates of indulgences. These indulgences were in essence licenses to commit any crime imaginable. They were said to forgive any sins one had committed. They also could be used to reduce the torture of loved ones in the flames of hell. But in order to make so many want to buy these, the church and its priests had to instill the fear of hell and hellfire into people, and that this torture was something to be dreaded. To any student of the words of Scripture and of Yeshua, hell is an event prepared for Lucifer and his legions, not a place where people are burning and being tortured by a God who sacrificed his own existence for them. The so-called Christian church has claimed authority which is not hers. Her priests claim the ability to forgive sin. This is what the Scriptures identify as blasphemy. The radical teaching of Yeshua was that men don't need intermediaries to access Jah. Man can speak directly to his Creator without the need of a middleman. To control people, you usually just need to put the fear into them. But love casts out fear. This idea that has been perpetuated for thousands of years of a divine being torturing bad people has just been a marketing campaign to scare the hell into people and to scare them into submission. Will fire be used to destroy those who hate Jah, Jannah, and all it stands for? In an event, yes, one time, for a moment. But that fire is kindled specifically for that hideous monster called Babylon. And the prophecies of Daniel foretold that this symbol of prophecy, the eternal city, would in fact not be eternal and would rule for only 1,260 years until the year of 1798. But even before that time ended, the rays of hope began to shine on the world. Truth is rarely popular, especially by those in power. And one of the prophecies had foretold of a moment when this empire, this beast of prophecy, would propose a change in the very laws of Jannah, the same ones given on Sinai thousands of years before, written by the hand of Michael before his incarnation as Yeshua. Rome claimed to have authority to change these, but she was never given this power of authority. And Yeshua made it clear he did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. This new system was just a way to blend the worship of a creator with the pagan worship of nature. And the church removed the commandment to not bow down to idols. And the biggest change, she claimed, was to make the first day of the week, the weekly holiday of the empire, the day of the sun, as the day for worship, and no longer the seventh day, as it had been for millennia. This is what the scriptures call the wine, a symbol of deception of Babylon. Around this time, Columbus is said to be on his voyage looking for the New World. The Light of Jannah is being printed by Gutenberg and others and read by more and more people. Around this time, a devout priest, Martin Luther, takes a journey to Rome, and he's about to enter the city, and he falls to the earth and says, "Holy Rome, I salute thee." Upon exiting the city, he writes, "No one can imagine what sins are committed in Rome. If there is a hell, Rome is built over it." And on October 31st, 1517, he posts 95 concerns he has with the abuses of the church he loves. But when the church and the state are united, Luther was really picking a fight with the empire. Maybe like a modern-day Edward Snowden revealing the abuses of the state and then rising to the top of the most wanted list. Now you know why this was so risky. Immediately, Luther's life was threatened. Just like the revolutionary teachings of Yeshua nearly 1,500 years prior, the same concept that anyone can escape the earth and be saved before it's too late, the very thing the sale of indulgences were profiting on, was now beginning to be offered freely by men like Luther. And Luther was teaching from Scripture that mankind can access Jah directly, rather than having to go through an intermediary. This marks the beginning of the protest against the dangers of mingling church and state, and so the Protestant Reformation begins. As soon as the Reformation began, a counter-reformation began. The Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, was initiated around this time to counter the influence and effects of Luther and the protesters. One author described that society like this: "The Society of Jesus was and is the most cruel, unscrupulous, and powerful of all the champions of the papacy." To combat the Protestants, Jesuitism inspired its followers with a fanaticism that enabled them to endure like dangers, and to oppose the power of truth, all the weapons of deception. There was no crime too great for them to commit, no deception too base for them to practice, no disguise too difficult for them to assume. Vowed to perpetual poverty and humility, it was their studied aim to secure wealth and power, to be devoted to the overthrow of Protestantism and the reestablishment of the papal supremacy. It was a fundamental principle of the order that the end justifies the means, and by this code, lying, theft, perjury, assassination were not only pardonable, but commendable when they served the interests of the church. And under various disguises, the Jesuits worked their way into offices of state, climbing up to be the counselors of kings, and shaping the policy of nations. They became servants to act as spies upon their masters. They established colleges for the sons of princes and nobles and schools for the common people. And the children of Protestant parents were drawn into the observance of the rites of the universal church. But Jah would see to it that freedom of conscience would not become extinct, and the new world was the only hope.